Welcome back. We're looking at the social impact of the worsening global economic crisis and what governments can do to soften that fall. From Geneva, I'm joined by Juan Somavia, the Director General of the International Labour Organization, where this week meetings are being held to examine how the more than 20 million people employed in the financial sector worldwide are being affected. And from New York is Jeffrey Sachs, renowned economist and Director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Dr. Sachs is also Special Advisor to the UN Secretary, Ban Ki-moon. Now, before we get back to our debate, we have the results of our chatroom poll. We asked, should government stimulus packages focus on social welfare? 86% of you said yes, they should, while only 14% of you said no, they shouldn't. Let's get back to our questions. Dr. Sachs, can you think of any clear periods in history where, in the past at least, that demonstrate the same kind of characteristics as this economic downturn? And I wonder, if that is the case, what lessons could be learned from those past periods?
Unfortunately, the example that is relevant, although we're not going to repeat it, I want to stress from the beginning, is the period of the late 1920s through the 1930s, the Great Depression, because that was the last synchronized financial crash of the international system. On a smaller scale, we had the Asian economic crisis of 1997-98. So we've learned a lot about how these crises work and what to do about them. Basically, Riz, there was an extraordinary bubble of wealth, of stock market wealth and housing, which was fueled by partly deregulated finance and partly by very easy monetary policy. That has all come crashing down, and the loss of paper wealth that results from the crash is extraordinary, perhaps $40 trillion when you add up the declines in all the stock markets around the world, plus the estimated losses on the housing stock. Now, consumers have stopped spending, and that's spiraling into closures of factories and unemployment. And we need to break that fall now by stimulating investment to replace that decline of consumption. The good thing is, and I'll just be brief here, the investments that the world really needs are investments in sustainable energy, investments in resilience on climate change, investments in conservation and so on, to make our societies more sustainable. So there are plenty of good things to spend resources on, and to help rechannel the world economy away from overconsumption towards investments for the future. That's what we really need to do.
Right. Mr. Somavia, you mentioned a little bit earlier in the first part of the show about how there is a need to be flexible with regulation sometime and deregulation at other times. Now, I know one of your big worries is that governments resort to protectionism at times of economic crisis, and I wonder what particular risks you see taking place right now.
Well, you know, in times of crisis, you have a natural tendency to be inward-looking, to care for your own. That's natural. Now, when you have a global economy, it's very difficult to have a series of inward-looking policies that are going to produce a global solution. It's not going to work. So yes, people have to sit around the table, look at what's going to happen with migrants, look at what's going to happen with beggar thy neighbor policies, be careful with all of the monies that are coming back to the banks. So that unless you discuss it, the natural thing is going to be to do things that others are going to say, hey, hold on. That's very good for you, but it's not good for me. And there I think that, following up on the previous conversation, I think that our lessons from the past is that in crisis, unemployment goes up the elevator, and they come down the staircase. That the economy recovers at one point in time, but the social consequences of that recovery are very long. Now, if we take those two elements in mind, we have to concentrate now on protecting as much as possible jobs. That means putting resources in the hands of smaller enterprises. If the credit crunch and the banks are not doing it, let the public system and governmental institutions do it. It's very little resources, you will save a lot of work. And on the other hand, you need to put income and income transfers and resources in the hand of the most vulnerable, the poor. You need to invest in training, retraining, and all that has to do with capacity building. And of course, a very central element that has proven in the past to be very useful, employment-intensive infrastructure.
Right.
These are things that can get going relatively quickly. You have things that can be done immediately, but you need to look towards the future. If we don't have a sustainable future with the sustainable development outlook, and a fair and inclusive globalization, it's not going to work.
On that issue of development, when you raised the word of sustainable development, on the issue of development, Dr. Sachs, we had an email that came in from a regular contributor, a viewer by the name of S. Anoma in Sydney, Australia, who wrote in saying, how will governments and international organizations address increasing poverty in Africa and other developing countries as pockets of poverty develop in the US and in EU countries? And I wonder, is there a significant risk of aid drying up now in these times?
Well, we're seeing in some countries, such as Italy, that the budget proposals are for slashing aid. This has to be resisted. But even more important, there are very particular, fairly low-cost things that can be done that can have a huge beneficial effect for the poor. And one that I'm very much stressing and very much encouraging of the donor countries is to pool their funds to help peasant farmers, smallholder farmers, get basic farm inputs, seed, fertilizer, small-scale irrigation, so that they can increase their food production. That's good for food security, for nutrition of children, and for income generation. That's the largest sector of small enterprise in the world is farmers, and the poorest farmers need help. And the evidence is that if we mobilize that help, we can actually increase the food supply double or triple in Africa in a short period of time. So this is a point that I'm hoping the G20 will take up. Secretary General is emphasizing this issue very much.
Dr. Sachs, a quick follow-up email, actually, if I may. We've just got a couple of minutes, but this one that came in from Uganda, from Adam in Uganda, says, what do you make of Dambisa Moyo's claims that aid to Africa has actually perpetuated poverty in that continent and should therefore be halted within 5 years? Do you think President Obama will continue the $5 billion aid to Africa that was started by George Bush, or will he be forced by the meltdown to address the crisis within the U.S.? Of course, referring to a book called Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo.
Yeah, I think such claims are absolutely pernicious and could lead to the deaths, actually, of millions of people. Because aid, when focused on getting AIDS medicines to people who need it, getting anti-malaria bed nets to children who need it, getting vaccinations, getting a bag of fertilizer to farmers for whom it's a difference of feeding themselves and feeding their families and not, make all the difference in the world. So, of course, aid needs to be focused, targeted in high priority areas. But this claim of this book that aid is bad, just cut it off, is absolutely wrong-headed and dangerous, and it's not said by someone who has a child in an African village. I think it's a shame to make such a claim, because people will die if that kind of policy were followed.
A minute to go, and Juan Somavia, if I may put to you the idea that perhaps now with some of the protectionist fears that we've been discussing, that borders such as those in the European Union might start to contract. I mean, there's been so much pride in having open borders and workforces crossing them. What do you see happening in an area such as the EU?
Look, I think that one of the essence of the European Union has been a European social model, and they care very much for that. Now, if they don't, in the European Union level, come around to discuss how they can deal with permitting that social system to be used by whoever lives in a particular country, then you're going to have problems. You see, the issue is in crisis moments, underlying tensions like racism or the reaction against foreigners on migrant workers or religious issues, become much more evident. And people give themselves a certain liberty to react in ways that under normal circumstances they wouldn't do it. And this requires leadership. Right. There's no way you can deal with this issue without political leadership to contest these questions.
Okay. Juan Somavia and Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, thank you both for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. On the next one, we ask, do Muslims believe attacks on the US troops are justified? How about attacks on civilians? A broad survey of Muslim public opinion spanning from Nigeria to Indonesia will be released tomorrow, and we'll speak with the pollsters to find out how the Muslim world feels about the current issues. From me and the team, see you next time.